here in St Mary Castlegate, in the city of York. This is possibly one of the earliest parish churches in the whole city. Certainly one of the most awe-inspiring, standing some 47 metres tall. The story starts 2,000 years ago in the Roman period, when a Roman mosaic was found nearby. There could well be a 7th century church, even a 10th century church on the site. We have an inscription that records 4 men founding a church here in that period. But what you're actually seeing around you is a product of the 15th century, with some 12th and 13th century fragments locked into it, prior to it being cleared out in the 1970s to make an architectural heritage centre, before in 2002 being converted to a contemporary arts venue.
Since that time, we've had a different installation almost every year, working with a whole range of artists who take very different approaches to the space and use very different materials. So, for example, we've worked with a glass artist, a textile artist, a sculptor, a mosaicist, a painter, an installation artist who've all responded in very different ways to the space. And it really is a truly inspiring venue, both for artists and for visitors, because obviously it's not what you think of as a normal contemporary art space. It's not a white cube. It comes with this incredible sense of history, and just the structure itself is kind of vast and huge.
The earliest fragments of the history of St Mary Castlegate lie in these pink, coarse-grained gritstone blocks. These are reused in the construction of the medieval church, either from the Roman walls of the city that predated it, or possibly even a pre-conquest church that sat on the site. We have a Roman mosaic that was found nearby in 1870, so tantalisingly their glimpse into a history of the site 2,000 years ago.
The first exhibition that we opened with was curated for us by Paul Bradley, and that opened in 2004, and it was called a Light Crescendo. So Paul brought together a number of different artists and artworks that really played with this idea of the light within the church, because this space is really unique in a sense of it being a contemporary art space that's just kind of filled with light. So in a normal gallery, the light is kind of controlled, and it's very often artificial light because you need to control the levels. But here we have these massive expanses of window, so you get this kind of wonderful change throughout the day and throughout the seasons.
We're now standing on somewhere we should never really be standing, on a concrete mezzanine built in the 1970s above the South Chapel. But it does give us a chance to really look at the medieval splendour the church would have once had through what are really small surviving fragments of the stained glass windows. York was famous for its stained glass production. Here we have St James the Great and St John the Baptist, really the only 2 surviving remnants of what was once a beautiful, resplendent, colourful, exotic church interior full of chantry chapels, tombs, stained glass windows and wall paintings.
Another artist that we worked with and we invited them to show their work here was Cornelia Parker, and we showed her 30 pieces of silver, which is a work that's now in the Tate collection. And that was really interesting because it obviously connects with that kind of religious idea of the church, and the story of the 30 pieces of silver with which Judas received for betraying Jesus. So that work filled the nave here, and it consisted of 1,000 items of silver which had been steamrolled, and then the artist created 30 discs of these objects, which were suspended just above the floor. So they hovered just about a foot from the floor, and they were suspended by these kind of very fine copper wires. And as the light changed through the day, you got these incredible reflections on the floor.
St Mary Castlegate ended its life as a church. It became redundant in the 1960s. The year of European architectural heritage resounded a new life for the church as an architectural centre. In the 1970s, it was stripped out, creating an empty vessel, but also more fundamental things were done to it. The floor in the central part of the nave was lowered, and we can see this quite clearly if we look below the columns, below the medieval architecture. We can follow down, and we should hit a ground level round about here somewhere. But because of the 1970s work, but now we can see exposed very clearly the foundations upon which the 15th century church was built.
Back in 2010, we worked with an artist, Susan Stockwell, who's very interested in using recycled materials, and she created this huge tower in the nave which kind of reached up to the roof, and this echoed the kind of really tall spire of St Mary's, and it was created with kind of tons of electrical components which were used kind of in everyday life and kind of dominate really kind of communications these days. There was this lovely link here between the church's role as a communicator and how we communicate today and how that's come to kind of dominate our lives.
We're here outside St Mary Castlegate Church, outside the south wall, looking at the 15th century style of the church from the outside. And here we see these amazing perpendicular windows and the verticals of the church that carry your eye up to God in effect. But still within that 15th century work, there are small fragments of the earlier church just glimpsing through, like this 13th century tiny lancet window encased in the later wall.
Some of the other works that we've commissioned for the space here include Five Sisters, which was produced by a duo of artists, a husband and wife team, Emma Biggs and Matthew Collins. And Emma is a mosaicist, and we let her loose in the Yorkshire Museum stores, and she was really kind of fascinated, intrigued by these medieval shards of pottery, kind of hundreds of boxes of them, which we have in the store here. Which we hold as a repository of all the excavations across the city. And what she decided to do was to take those shards and turn them into something new. So she created this huge mosaic which filled the nave and really kind of echoed the history of the church in terms of how it had been transformed and changed over its life, but also the kind of very subtle tonal qualities of the different stones that have been used within building the fabric of the church.
The earliest architectural elements of the church, though, are these arcade in the north aisle. These columns that start here at their bases and rise up through their cylindrical columns to what we call a scallop capital, so what looks a bit like a squashed cushion on the top of it. And these are mid-12th century, so 1150s, and they're very different to what we see from the earlier fragments. These are made of magnesian limestone, a very fine, beautifully carved stone, and with very fine tooling marks still visible. So each line, in effect, is the chisel mark of the mason as he's going around forming what's called a drum column, a cylindrical block that would be built on top of each other.
The fabric of the church here at St Mary's has also provided inspiration for a number of other artists working here, one of which was Breathing Space, and that was produced by artist Caroline Broadhead back in 2006. And what Caroline decided to do with the space was to split it effectively in half. So she created a kind of a lower and an upper level within the church by suspending a layer of wadding, which was originally kind kind of mattress wooding, and this was suspended across the church, so you could either walk underneath it, and it was very low, so you had to kind of scurry along underneath it, or you could actually go onto the mezzanine level in the church and look above it. And it was this spectacular effect of kind of heaven and earth, because from above you could just see this massive white fluffiness, but underneath it almost felt like you were cocooned in this kind of wonderful kind of space. And there was a soundtrack to that work as well, which was a baby's breath. So it did almost feel womb-like.
Although not a wealthy parish, St Mary's of Castlegate was a very successful parish which constantly expanded its church. In the 13th and 14th centuries, it pushed the south aisle further out, making and adding these octagonal columns in this particular case, with a very similar shaped capital atop, very different to the earlier drum-shaped columns and the scallop capitals we saw from the 12th century, done in a very different style, with in this case with a claw chisel, a much coarser set of tooling, which gives it a very nice date for the construction.
So in 2006, we worked with an artist called Susie McMurray. She produced a work called Echo. This involved suspending very fine threads from the ceiling of the church, and she used hundreds of hairnets, and each of these was filled with kind of used violin hair, which is horsehair. So you had this kind of wonderful connection to human body and experience, and the musicality as well. I think she had previously trained as a musician, so that kind of partly inspired the work. But it was almost kind of ethereal. When you see the shots of the work, it's kind of this kind of web of hairnets, almost like a kind of spider's web or a cobweb kind of filling the church. So there's this idea that maybe it's been shut up for a long time and it's suddenly been revived. In 2007 to 8, we worked with a glass artist called Keiko Makide, who came into the church and produced a number of different elements which formed an installation called The Memory of Place. And the central component of that was a huge pool which filled the centre of the nave, and visitors were invited to take votive candles and float them onto the pool to remember loved ones. At the other end of the nave there was a kind of huge, very tall pillar called the Pillar of Light, which was composed of a central supporting rod with glass rods all around it, and obviously because of the spectacular qualities of light within the church, it really kind of glistened and shone and kind of had different effects throughout the day, and it was almost as if it's kind of pointing up to the heavens. York St Mary's is an incredible space with a rich history and its own unique atmosphere. It provides this haven of tranquility and contemplation away from the busy shopping streets that surround it. We've had a huge variety of different artists who've responded to the church in very different ways over the last few years, and their installations have really explored the church's unique atmosphere and history, and we're looking forward to seeing how different artists respond to the church and produce different works in response to the space, how they explore it and reveal the different layers of meaning in the coming years.